Welcome, everyone, to this webinar, Managing for Operational and Financial Performance in a Period of Uncertainty. We're going to be looking at the intermodal operators in the COVID-19 crisis today with some great experts. We are really lucky today to have a great lineup of skilled experts from our member company, Alex Partners. And I'd like to thank them for joining us today and bringing their insight and their experience to help us out. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce them and ask them to say just a little bit about their background for us to kind of fill in the blanks a little bit. So first up is Mark Yampieri.
Great, thanks, Hal. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending the webinar today. So it says here 20 years, actually it's a little bit longer than that. For some reason, I made the decision that I was going to make a career and pursue my passion for transportation logistics as a teenager when I decided to pursue a degree in logistics. And it's been a great journey since then. Over the last 20 years, I've worked for both the buyers of transportation and logistics services, as well as the service providers. And along that theme, currently right now, I'm currently working with a intermodal logistics services provider, as well as a fairly large buyer of those services, not necessarily of each other's services, but on both sides of the table. Look forward to the Q&A at the end, and hopefully this session is informative and interesting for you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mark. Next up, we have Peter Appel.
Thanks very much, Hal. As with Mark, I am also kind of a lifelong, career-long transportation person. I got caught up in transportation as an undergrad and have continued since, working across several different modes of transportation. Did my graduate work focusing on airline operations and economics. My first job in transportation was in the railroad industry. I've done a couple of stints at the U.S. Department of Transportation, most recently heading the R&D division of the U.S. DOT about 10 years ago. And then in between, most of my career has been in management consulting to both carriers and shippers across ocean, surface, rail, and air. And really enjoy working across the different modes and sort of looking at how operational issues really cross the realm of transportation. Really happy to be here. There are certainly several clients that I've had in the past that are members of IANA, so and I know it's a great group to work with.
Thank you, Peter. And next up, we have Jim Blaser.
Hey, thanks for having me. I thought this was a panel. I didn't realize this was a support group for transportation enthusiasts. I guess I make three here. I'm a lifelong transportation observer, pundit, journalist, and now consultant. Been with Alex for about 7 years now, and in that time I've worked extensively with Mark and Peter and others in our practice, focused both on the shipper side and on the operator side, as well as infrastructure, ports and terminals and the like. So thanks for having us again. Appreciate it.
It's great to have you all. I appreciate it. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you to get us rolling.
Okay, so I'm going to get started just with a quick overview. And I'm going to cut to the chase. The most important word on this page is the word uncertain. We all know what has happened with the economy, with container volumes, with cost pressures in the industry. We know the forecasts of volume are down substantially, but the issue that we're really most here to talk about is the uncertainty that we don't know when and to what extent this industry will recover. And a business facing uncertainty or significant uncertainty has to look at business decisions in a very different way than a business that A, knows they're growing at a certain rate, or B, perhaps knows they're declining at a certain rate. So that's kind of the underlying theme of what we want to talk about. So short-term indicators, we look at a lot of blank sailings data. We look at the March and April TEU numbers. No need to tell most of the folks on this call about it. They're down many ports in double digits in March. Some of them, the descent has slowed a bit in April, but there are a lot of factors that can cause the next couple of quarters to be problematic. The GDP forecasts themselves are all over the map, and again, creating this uncertainty moving forward. So what does that? What questions does that put on the table for an operator? And when we say operator, we're talking about really anybody that could be a member of IANA, whether you operate a terminal or whether you own a fleet of assets for drayage or a whole range of pieces of the chain. how do you maintain margin and cash flow during a downturn? But as I said, more significantly, how do you address the uncertainty given what many in this field face, which is very high fixed cost of the operation, inability to flex up and down easily. Between the three of us on this call, we work with many different intermodal operators, and some of the things we tend to see in common is that you can achieve great productivity as an operator in intermodal, but what contributes to productivity is predictability. You can get more container moves per hour if you're doing it in a predictable way month in and month out. If there is an outside event that causes volumes to either go up or down significantly, it can hit your productivity, and we could talk a little bit more about that. Another thing, leading into that is, in order for the economists to be correct that this very significant downturn going on in late Q1 and into Q2 is going to recover significantly in Q3 and Q4, which it very well may do, that's kind of going to have this kind of whiplash effect that says, okay, now that you've gone down very quickly, you're going to go up very quickly. It's a challenging environment to be in. So what we, as AlixPartners, look at is what are the things that a business needs to keep in mind. AlixPartners, as a firm, works across every industry. The three of us work in transportation. We have colleagues that work in retail. We have colleagues that work with consumer products and restaurants. And what we find is a lot of the basic decisions businesses need to make have a lot in common across these industries, but there's some things very specific to transportation, infrastructure, intermodal that we want to emphasize. Within that framework, we want to talk about three phases of the operation. The red phase, which is what we've been going through since March. There's a crisis facing us immediately, what to do about it now. An amber phase, which is we're coming out of the crisis, how do we get ourselves on the right glide path? And a green phase, which is what do we prepare for the new normal of the future? So we're going to talk about all three of those in this presentation. I'm going to turn to Mark just to talk about container activity for a moment.
Thanks, Peter. The one thing that typically grabs the headlines are kind of the macro issues, but one interesting thing about transportation, it's very local. So if you look at Los Angeles as an example, the March decline was pretty material. Obviously, there's certain trades that we're still experiencing, some planned slowdowns there based on the start of the spread of COVID-19, but also kind of the extension of the New Year holiday. But then you look over to some of the other ports where there wasn't such a significant difference between March and April. So when you're thinking about your business, obviously these local variations are important. It's something to consider. But if you just take a look across these, and I think they're fairly decent representations. New York and some of the Canadian ports aren't represented here, but 10% plus reduction of volume is the reality, right? I mean, that is what we're facing now. And I think we're all very optimistic and hopeful that things are going to spring back. But at this point right now, with the information out there, I think it's prudent to continue to plan as if this is a new, unfortunately, lower step change that we're gonna have to adjust to. But the forecasts are uncertain. And so when we look at overall GDP, which certainly is going to have an impact to someone who's more of a national or multi-region operator, just from a couple days ago, looking at 5 to 6% down for the US. That's material, right? And that is going to have a trickle down effect, and potentially a delayed impact, which can basically hurt these volumes. The other thing to consider is over the last, we'll say 45 to 60 days, there was a spike in demand for transport, primarily for things that I would consider kind of basic staples, run on food, paper products, things that are relatively inexpensive but are necessities. One thing in common, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are locally produced, right? So if you see, where some of the bright spots are, they weren't necessarily from imports, and a lot of them aren't even products that are produced in one central location and distributed. They're somewhat spread out. because the cost of freight for these low value goods is hard to have that be sort of a national distribution play. So I appreciate that we're starting off with a little bit of doom and gloom, but I think it's important to kind of ground ourselves with where we are right now and be able to have a plan that allows this kind of new normal, this environment for the business to be sustained. And then as we get into some of the other phases and have a plan to emerge, that you're able to get to that point. And so with that, Peter, you want to go ahead and take the next one and talk about, kind of the projections moving forward?
Absolutely. And I'm going to take this page very, very quickly. This page is not about the numbers, it's about the variance. And this was a survey conducted a month ago by the National Association of Business Economists. 45 leading corporate economists. What they do for a living is forecast things like GDP growth. And they were surveyed to say, okay, sitting there in April of 2020, what do you think GDP year over year change will be for Q2, for Q3, and Q4? And what these bars show is for each of the quarters, what the median was, estimate at the time was. For example, in Q2, the median forecaster felt that you're going to be down 26% year over year. And then in Q3, the median said, okay, we're going to have a slight rise. And then by Q4, the median says, a modest 6% rise. The story is within that group of 45 economists, the variances of what they thought. So for example, in Q3, the 5 lowest predictors felt that Q3 year over year would be down 13%, where the 5 highest predictors felt it would be up 21%. We don't know who's right, we don't know who's wrong. That's not what this page is about. The page is about people that are pretty well qualified to assess these things, have wildly differing opinions, unprecedentedly different opinions. So when you read news articles about how bad this potential recession is, how bad this recession is, and how it compares to 08, how it compares to the Great Depression, that's one metric to look at, and we don't know the answer there. But another metric that it's clear we know the answer is the level of unpredictability associated with this is higher than anyone has seen, and that is a big deal. Getting back to that uncertainty topic I was talking about. So I'm going to move on from that and turn over to Jim to talk specifically about sailings.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it. So let me just take a minute and explain this chart because or the charts because there's quite a few on here. On the left-hand side of the page, we're looking at container shipments, or I should say container vessel sailings from Far East Asia to North America, West Coast ports on the left, and on the right-hand side there to the East Coast ports. What each of these sides show is how many sailings per week and then how many of them were blanked. And I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with the term blanked, but basically it means it was canceled. So we saw this major spike just looking at the upper left-hand chart, Far East Asia to the West Coast. Again, this is ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, the Pacific Northwest. In week 7, reaching 23 of the sailings that were on the schedule were blanked, more than half, right? So it's a pretty significant impact. And if you go back to week 7, you're talking about February. Here in North America, we were sitting here watching China shut down and try to lock down and prevent further spread of COVID. And so the ripple effect that has is that volume's not produced, it doesn't ship, the ships don't move, the volume doesn't show up here in the U.S. And as you go out further into weeks 18, 19, and we don't need to tell any of these audience members. You all read the AAR data. The year-over-year intermodal volumes are down, 25, 27, 23% in the teens weeks here this year, and it's largely due to the fact that China shut down, the ships didn't move, the volume didn't hit these shores, and it didn't move on your rails. So we see that as a pretty significant impact. I mean, for terminals, this is disastrous, right? Because for terminals that get paid on a per move basis, regardless of whether the box is full or empty, and it's just about the move, and when they don't have those vessels calling, it's millions of dollars of lost revenue opportunity. When we think about the lost opportunity, looking at a year-over-year basis, every one of these blank sailings, could have been a ship full of boxes landing, in a port like Los Angeles or Long Beach, that would then dispatch maybe a half dozen or more double-stack trains headed east. So you think about these ripple effects, and so one of the things we look at as really an indicator of where the distress is stemming from is this blank sailings data. I think, as you look at the bottom of these tables, just sort of dimensionalize, it's one thing to look at how many vessels were blanked, But if you think about how much of the actual capacity, on the lower left-hand side there, we called out 46% of the capacity was canceled in the month of February. That's a huge amount of freight that just didn't materialize. So real big sort of pain for the industry, and we think this is an interesting way to sort of dimensionalize that. Peter, I think I'll pass to the next page here, if that's okay.
Great. So one thing I want to touch on here that's not on the page, but in this stage of where we are now, which I think some have been experiencing for a few months now, the number one thing you need to focus on is the health and safety of your employees. That is absolutely critical. The equipment, the facility, it can't operate without the team there. And so, having that plan, making sure that people feel comfortable, making sure that it's effective is really the critical first step. And I think most companies took that first step a while ago, but I wanted to call that out, that wasn't an oversight. But in this stage, really, cash is king. I like the saying, you want to live to fight another day. You've got to make decisions to have excess cash in order to be able to make decisions. And some of those could even be opportunistic. It may not even be about survival. It may be about being able to make an asset purchase at a very attractive rate because you feel confident that you can grow the business. But that's first. In order to do that, you got to look at all the different levers to conserve cash. And you need to have a communication plan with all of your trade partners. So suppliers, customers, and they all are in different situations, and understanding that allows you to make decisions and potentially unlock some cash that you typically wouldn't go after. The real way to do that and have success is to really try to centralize those decisions. In many cases, for clients, we'll appoint somebody, typically in a treasury function, as a cash czar, and basically empower them to make decisions on how the company's money is spent that typically would be with a functional group. And that's not always the most popular decision, but it's a very effective one, and it's temporary. The 13-week cash flow forecast, it's funny. A company that I was working with that was having some issues where they were potentially close to breaching covenants with their lenders asked, at what point in time should you have one of these programs where you're trying to accurately forecast what your cash looks like for the next 13 weeks, right? The next quarter. And the answer is, well, certainly before you get to this point, right? You don't want to do this when you feel like you're running out of cash. You want to do this before, so you can predict. We look like we're going to have a problem here in about 2 months. Now we have time to make decisions to be able to hopefully mitigate that. And that's absolutely an activity that you do when you don't need it. But of course, human behavior, human nature, no one wants to do it until you need to. So that's one where it's a little counterintuitive, but it's pretty important. And the other, again, not very popular. What are the projects we can mothball? What are the things that we can put on hold? Right, and so those actions are pretty effective. And then you really need to double down and focus on maintaining the customers and running the business, looking at some downside cases, looking at what's an alternative if we've got people that are calling out and we can't operate within a certain location. Do we have a realistic plan B? Is there an adjustment to service that is temporary, that can be communicated to customers to allow for a different work environment? Those are all things that are on the table. I will tell you that some of the ideas that clients have thought of, didn't necessarily put into place over the last 60 days, are things that 6 months ago they would be embarrassed to even bring up. But everything's on the table right now, but the key is to actively communicate with both sides of your trade partners to ensure that you're making a decision that's right for both parties. And then lastly, I don't know if it's a real word or not, but make all of your costs as variable as possible. And for asset-intensive businesses, that's difficult, right? And we get that. But there are some things that can be done if you're willing to make adjustments to things that historically were considered a constant, right? Or were considered something that you had to continuously offer. Maybe you don't, right? And a lot of businesses that are asset intensive, it seems like they're variable on the way up, but they're not on the way down. Those types of decisions have to be made. These are, again, not very popular. These decisions typically involve labor. They typically involve layoffs. They typically involve potentially furloughs given the situation. And you have to question, what are the core activities versus non, right? If you have to preserve cash and if you have to reduce costs, are there departments, are there functions that aren't required to run the day-to-day operations for a period of time? There's probably some harm to the business over the course of several years if you didn't have those continuous improvement type programs, but for 3 months you could live with it. And so, taking a clean sheet and thinking through what we absolutely need to keep to operate, the assets that we absolutely need and are core to our business, and then the very difficult decision, and unfortunately this is happening right as the country's looking at declining GDP, potential recession. You have to think about your most variable costs, and a lot of times those are people costs. So Peter, I appreciate that I get to share some of the doom and gloom. However, there will be an emergence, and I think it's important that you talk about making that plan now so you're ready when we start seeing those initial green shoots.
Thanks, Mark. And I think there will be some doom cutting across all these zones. There's never a pretty story about any of these things, but you got to make the best of the situation. For example, Mark was just a moment ago talking about, hey, what are the non-core activities you could do without for 3 months? But let's take it a step further. The scrutiny that you're placing on your costs right now can help you not only in the short term by figuring out how you get through to live another day, but also to think about costs that you never really scrutinized before and maybe you should have. So it's very possible that when you find a non-core activity that you should take it away for 3 months and then as things recover, perhaps bring it back. But it's also possible you shouldn't. And that's where institutionalizing, in some cases, a lower cost base means some of these reductions should be sustained if you determine that your core offering is not helped by this additional expenditure. If you find, and I'll take an example from a different industry. We're recently working with a client. They had 7 different distribution centers, and one of the things our firm does a lot of is footprint optimization. And we were doing an analysis that says, yeah, you probably could do this with 4 or 5 distribution centers. And they had batted around that idea, in past years and never had reduced. And then COVID hit, and they needed to furlough some people in order to deal with the lower volume. And they did temporarily shut down a couple of those distribution centers. And the story here is, it's very possible that they shouldn't open them up again. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, hasn't been decided yet, but this is the time to think about it. You've already looked at what it means to your operation to make a structural change. Don't automatically assume you should go back to where you started. Look for where you can institutionalize efficiency driving cost reductions. But also, and one thing we certainly know about this industry, the intermodal industry, the fundamental foundations, the IT systems, terminal operating systems, tracking systems, and the like, these are long lead time activities. You probably didn't make significant changes in your IT systems when you were trying to cut costs significantly in a course of a few weeks in March and April. But ultimately, if you see opportunities where you have been able to bring down your cost structure, but in order to make them sustainable, you need to make changes in your IT systems, this is the time, this amber zone is the time to think about what it takes to do that. Procurement savings opportunities as well. The supply markets in almost everything anyone buys today are changing. Some of them are getting more difficult, some of them are getting more attractive. Fuel is coming down in price, other things are going up in price. You really want to understand your supply markets and understand them well, because you can certainly bet that the folks on the other side of the negotiations table are understanding the future of those markets. So you need to understand how you can leverage procurement to your advantage and work with customers to streamline, I should say, operational handoffs and transactions. I don't know how that got in there, but Handoffs between intermodal is all about handoffs between one piece in the chain or the next. Very often there are inefficiencies in those handoffs. As you can streamline those functions, container moving point A from storage to point A to point B can be made more efficient. Think about what you did in the near term when you had lower volume to make it faster. Think about how you can improve that in the longer term. Middle column is just a carry on to Mark's discussion about cash. Yes, you had to get through a potential cash crisis in the first few weeks. Coming out of it, you want to understand, maintain the liquidity you're going to need to have to ramp back up again. Ramping up costs more than keeping it steady state. You just need to have a buffer and minimum liquidity required to do it. And then finally, understand the go forward market. As I implied from a procurement perspective, but also from your business perspective, every supply market is going to be affected in the medium and potentially long term by this crisis. Sources of manufacturing that were core in 2019 might be a little bit different in 2021, with manufacturing shifts based on trade issues and public policy issues and the like. Anticipate where the traffic's coming from and where it's going, because it's very unlikely to be exactly the same as it was before this hit. And make sure you as an operator are well positioned to take advantage of those changing markets. Your customers, in addition to coming from different places and going to different places, might be looking for different services from you. With uncertainty comes, less of a premium on getting the box, quickly to where it needs to go. And sometimes the premium is on giving us some options, storing it for a while. Make sure you're able to adapt to those changing needs of your customers. And then also, as activity levels go down, and perhaps you do have the bandwidth to improve service levels, particularly in areas that have been a sore spot for customers, in recent months, this potentially is your chance to strengthen those relationships. So I'm going to move to the go forward and Jim.
Yeah, no, I'm the ghost of intermodal future. So thanks, Peter. So I think, same format here as we talk about, where Mark sort of sowed the fear, uncertainty of doubt, and Peter talked about sort of the emerging green shoots. Here in the green zone, we want to talk about, customers, competitors, and just the overall economics of what the future might look like. I think, on the left-hand side, starting with customers have tossed out old paradigms. Well, from an intermodal operator perspective, your customers are tossing out their paradigms because their customers are tossing out their paradigms. Mark and I and some of our other team members, we did a webcast a couple weeks ago on home delivery and last mile markets. And, one of the themes that we see there is that, the COVID crisis is serving as a bit of an accelerator for e-commerce adoption. Consumers are becoming more willing and interested to buy things online, sight unseen, for delivery to their home in categories that we hadn't really seen that before, such as like healthcare, even, consumer staples and groceries. And largely that's driven because they don't have a choice right now, right? Many markets, like where I live in New York, it's been curbside pickup or delivery only for many businesses. When the world sort of gets back on its axis here, we expect that, a lot of that to hold, right? And that there will be an acceleration of adoption of e-commerce and other new ways of buying and transacting across categories that weren't necessarily fully penetrated before. And that's going to have effects back into the intermodal supply chain as well. We see it now with the significant amount of retailers that are scaling back their store footprints or going bankrupt and really closing their store footprints. And what that means for sort of the traditional retail supply chain could be quite significant. And that's a significant amount of intermodal volume, as we know, and some of the more attractive volume in some cases too. So when the world comes back to steady state, don't expect that your customers are going to have the same norms. I think the other thing that's going to come out of this is in changing their paradigms, I think they'll also change significantly their cost structures, and they'll be much more efficient. Just like we've talked about in the intermodal landscape, if you can sort of weather the storm, you should be stronger on the other side. Your customers and their customers will be in the same position. Those who survive the fallout will be much more fit. And so I think that there's some things that are obviously beneficial to that. And I think intermodal is an important part of many supply chains, and I think could become more ingrained with some, but it also has, some challenges related to what are those shifts in the dynamics of the supply chain and how are those going to suit intermodal cargoes. Similarly, about sort of the strengths and weaknesses, moving to the middle column, your competitors, those of you who survive will be stronger on the other side. And could be fiercer competitors for that volume. I think that that's a concern you have to sort of wrestle with. As survival is one thing, but what's the long-term advantage that you're going to try to sow now so you can reap that later? How do you become more efficient so that you can compete with presumably more efficient competitors? The last side of this is something I think we'll talk about in our next slide, but also maybe in the Q&A, because I know Peter and Mark have some viewpoints on this. The economics of asset ownership. Peter, I think this was I'm sort of paraphrasing your comment from our green room, but assets ownership, it becomes more risky. It should also come at more of a premium in the future, right? And so if those who maintain the boxes and the chassis and the rail cars and all the equipment that's needed to run this intermodal infrastructure, if they're going to put their necks out and own that equipment, they're going to ask for more in return. And how does that change the dynamics of being an intermodal provider in this market across many of the links in the supply chain? One thing I think here that we'll talk about on the next page as well is, if you are taking on more risk in the new environment, you should carefully make sure that you get paid for it, right? And so there's some comments or some to-dos that we have on the next page related to that. Lastly, I think the uncertainty here, and Peter, I think, set it up well before with the varying degrees of uncertainty or sort of differing views of the recovery shape and duration. We don't really know, right? And no one knows on that. That's what I think Peter's page said very well. But I think what we do know is it's not going to be easy to get to the green zone, and those that do will probably be in a much better shape on the other side of it, but probably be fewer. Consolidation and overall reduction of players in the space, I think, is likely. Peter, maybe I'll pass it back to you to MC us through the last page.
Jim. And before I go to the next page, I want to throw out one example for the last column of page 11, which very fortunately is not in this industry, which you should all breathe a sigh of relief about. And this example that we've faced, we do a lot of work in oil and gas. And as many of you know, the fracking industry has really taken off in the last few years. And there's been a whole lot of frack sand moved around the country. And that market has fallen apart in the last few months. But meanwhile, over the last few years, there's been a massive ordering of rail hopper cars that are designed specifically for heavy frack sand. And there are thousands and thousands of these cars out there that were built up for the demand of 2017, 2018, 2019, and now they're sitting idle. And quite simply, there's a chance that some of these frack sand cars will just never be needed again. This is a perfect illustration of the heavy risk. If you're the owner, if you're the bank that owns those frack sand cars, and the operator ends up having financial distress and you're never going to get a return on that, you're stuck with those cars, and the cost of owning that asset is dramatically higher than you originally forecasted to be. As I said, I throw that example out partly because this is not an intermodal example and it's much more extreme, but it shows the nature of the risk premium that asset owners face in a highly unpredictable economy. So perhaps we sincerely hope and believe that in intermodal, that the ups and downs aren't going to be anywhere near as significant as that, but it illustrates the issue. I'm going to move on to page 12. I'll try to go through this pretty quickly. It's a quick wrap up. Mark, do you want to talk about the first couple?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So under managed cash, I think this applies to companies in any area of the spectrum, from having a fortress balance sheet and have excess cash to those that have current liquidity issues, covenant issues, or have significant leverage. In the first example, I think it's really an opportunity to be opportunistic. And as an example, I've worked with clients that had no cash needs, forecasted even in their downside scenario a year of operations without any cash needs, but fully drew on their revolver. Why? Because they had access to it, and debt is pretty cheap right now. And so they have that for flexibility, and it gives them, optionality, and that has value. Right now, yes, there's some interest expense there, but the potential to, acquire some assets at very attractive prices in the next several months is probably worth it, right? On the flip side, you need to do that, just to make sure you get to the next stage. Same thing goes with CapEx, right? And I would argue that this one here, you should be focused on it, but it applies to both ends of the spectrum. Are there opportunities where you can add equipment that you don't necessarily need because the deal is too good to be true? I think that's probably not the case for most people, but that theoretically is out there. But consider delaying, consider having conversations with OEMs about delaying, canceling. Have a conversation about what are my cancellation fees for my entire 2021 order. Start the conversation with that. That's a good icebreaker. And then talk about what are the repercussions? What can we do to maybe rethink the plan? And then the last one I think is probably a little controversial under the CapEx program, which is, if absolutely necessary, consider deferring some maintenance CapEx. Now, some of that will cost you more in the long run. We completely get that. But there are some labor saving strategies where some things are done in advance. There are some things that you do for potentially more reliability that isn't necessary. Obviously, anything safety related would need to be removed from that evaluation. But this is something that companies are doing. It's something that needs to be on the table. Peter, do you want to cover the next
number
two?
three? A lot of number three is the flip side of exactly what Mark was just talking about. Just like you're going to have to understand your relationship with your CapEx vendors and the like, and perhaps defer some things. You got to realize your customers are changing a lot, and you got to understand how that's going to affect payments. You have to be proactive in working through your relationships with your customers on payment terms, on understanding potential for late payments, and also things like surcharges and accessorials. Not necessarily, putting new surcharges out there, but as many in this industry face, there are charges that are sometimes not assessed, and sometimes when you have contractual capability of assessing them, understand what options you have in terms of collecting for things you haven't been necessarily collecting for. See if the costs associated with providing those services would justify charging for things that perhaps you haven't charged for before. Just review all those terms and relationship terms with your customer. Again, number four, just recapping, aggressively targeting fixed costs. We talk about SG&A overhead costs because those are sometimes the easiest to really understand in terms of what is truly a fixed cost. Just look at those carefully, understand if your overall volume is going down, if you don't cut these fixed costs, your cost per unit is going to go up significantly, and you want to stay ahead of it. Jim?
Sure, yeah, I'll take us from 5, 6, and 7 here just to round it out. I think the overall message is to tighten your belt, right? I mean, make sure that you have, as you talked about earlier, I think Mark and Peter, you both brought this up, making sure you address your variable costs and make sure they truly are variable. We see this often in assessments we do where the variable cost just doesn't change as fast as demand or as the company wants it to, because there just are sort of decisions or structure or there's a lack of governance in place to really drive that change. So it's a hard thing to do and something you got to keep your eye on. Peter, you talked about procurement savings. I hate to say it, but this is the kind of environment where you got to make sure that you are getting the best deals you can and take something back from your vendors. You can drive revenue with value-added services on just the last one here. We mentioned this a minute ago. I think this in transportation is a really timely topic. Collect your accessorials and all the charges that you're owed and make sure that you don't leave any on the table. We see this quite a bit in the containerized trade. So I'll wrap it up with that. I think at this point, we're going to go to questions, right, Hal?
Exactly. Thanks, gents. I appreciate it. That was terrific. Let's jump into some questions here. You touched on cash flow quite a bit. Are there better ways to manage cash flow in a recession, or whatever you want to call what we're in currently?
I think the answer is potentially yes, depending upon what your current process is. For those of you that have private equity ownership, you may already have a 13-week cash program of monitoring it, so there's a good understanding of why there's variations. And the key isn't just to do reporting to report. That's a big waste of time. The key to doing reporting is to hopefully drill down to what the underlying root cause of the variance is, understand why it's occurring, will it repeat, and is there anything you can do about it? Peter brought up a very important point that a lot of people miss, and I've seen this happen several times. On the way down, you cut costs, volume's dropping, and you're maintaining, and then things start to pick up. Well, before you start to get back to where you were, you will incur the cost before you collect the revenue, and an increase in business activity will cause a cash crunch. It's very counterintuitive, but it happens. So I think having that plan and having a good financial analyst model out what happens when business picks up immediately by 10%, that could be a real problem on your cash flow.
Very interesting. Here's one that I think some folks must be thinking about, or more than just some folks. Does it make sense to negotiate longer-term deals with customers right now to try to lock in their business?
I think the answer is to that one is maybe. I think you have to review every customer relationship you have or you want and look at the value of it to your portfolio, the profitability on it, and say what makes most sense. I think every vendor of any kind and every service provider of any kind should have a mix of different length relationships depending on where they fit in your customer portfolio. But certainly the answer in some cases is absolutely yes. When you find a situation where you can provide more stability and more predictability of your future operation by negotiating longer relationship with your core customers, that's great. Just keep in mind that you're going to have to pay something for that, and they're going to try to get something out of it too.
Hey, can I just add one thing to that, Peter? I mean, I think you're 100% right, but I would also argue that you can make them transparent and fair and sort of index-based in some instances where I think if you set a price and a volume target today, going back to the slide you had about, what the experts think about the direction of the economy, invariably you're going to be wrong, and you or your vendor or your customer are going to be on the wrong side of the deal, and that's not good. So, but I think if you set a clear, fair deal that has some metrics in it that can be monitored and reset over time based on that events, I think that makes a ton of sense to do exactly what you just talked about.
That's great. Here's one. You guys talked a little bit about sort of doing that difficult self-analysis to really understand your business and what it means to have core activities. This question gets to that. You talked a bit about identifying those non-core activities and considering eliminating them. Do you have any advice on assessing what is actually core and non-core for folks?
You want to look at your revenue. You want to look at the money flowing in and saying what is causing that revenue to come in. In some cases, if you're a terminal operator and you move a container and you charge per move, it's clear that activity of moving that container is causing that revenue to come in. That's the obvious side. The less obvious side is, you go to a conference, you send someone on a sales trip. You want to just look more closely at what linkage you can come up with between engaging in that activity and driving revenue. And don't assume that just because you engage in activities you've been engaging in for the last 5, 10, 15 years, don't assume those activities are going to drive revenue. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. So we can't answer the question of what's core and what's not core, but you can, as an operator, look closely and really scrutinize what is it about this activity that we believe led to revenue, or perhaps are we unable to find a linkage between this activity and revenue.
Good advice. We've got time for probably one, maybe two more. So here's one. For someone planning on either selling or maybe shuttering, just closing up their business, are there any tips that you have for preparing for that process?
I'll start. I mean, if you're preparing to shutter a business, I think you need to figure out what the mechanism is going to be for that. Are you going to do this in court or out of court? And there's various sort of advantages and disadvantages to either. I know, Mark, you're working on a case that's close to this yet. You want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to just lay out, what you're trying to accomplish and what the outcome you want. And there's a lot of different considerations. If it's a subsidiary, is it just a specific service offering? Is it the entire operation? And then, at least within the United States, the bankruptcy court provides you with a set of tools that can be advantageous in a lot of situations, but also can create incremental risk as well. And so you really need to think through that. But the most important thing is to surround yourself with internal stakeholders of the company that are able to have an unbiased view to really lay out a plan. And unfortunately, it's difficult for some people to have an unbiased view about the company that currently employs them. And that's a really tough, thing to ask someone to do. And certainly, there's advisors that can help you think through the pros and cons of that. But developing the plan and deciding whether or not an in-court process can be beneficial to you, I think is really the key first step.
Super. One last question. You guys talked a fair bit around assets. There seems to be a perennial question in intermodal: asset heavy, asset light, non-asset, in terms of the way to go, or what's the optimal way, what's the right model. Do you see a shift away from assets because of the downturn?
I think it really depends on how the market prices risk. And unfortunately, it's not always liquid or efficient in the short term. And so, one argument would be, well, why wouldn't you be asset light as long as there's plenty of other trade partners out there are willing to take on the risk and not charge a premium for it? Why should I? However, that argument doesn't hold true if a lot of the actual asset operators decide that this isn't worth it and we're out. And so you've got that balance. I think really the evaluation should be on how that risk of the asset not being able to be utilized or have a lot of demand against it, how you cost that risk and how do you pass it through. If you're the only game in town and there's a lot of demand, you want to own that asset. But if that's not the case, obviously you can kind of, fall anywhere within that continuum. But that evaluation, I think, is pretty critical. But you have to take a forward-looking view. And, to complicate things, as we said earlier, the one thing that's certain is that we have a lot of uncertainty for at least the next probably 6 to 12 months. In that case, it's hard to make the case to justify more asset purchases unless the price is too good to be true.
Right. No, I think that's a great great way to look at it. Well, I think with that, we're going to wrap up. We've got a lot of resources around the coronavirus, kind of making the way through that on our resource page. So if you want to shoot over to intermodal.org, you can find information there, or just email us at info@intermodal.org. I do want to take another opportunity to thank our year-long sponsors. These folks really make a lot of what we do at IANA possible, including our educational program, which this is obviously part of. We bring these free to the intermodal supply chain thanks to our year-long sponsors as a way to pay back and to make sure that supply chain flows. So I want to tip the cap to the organization, to them, thank them. And I want to thank our panel one more time for spending this time with us. Great information. Really appreciate you guys digging in and kind of breaking down what's a very challenging management case that we're all presented with for us in really kind of a great little playbook for approaching this and keeping cool and doing the homework, checking your numbers and doing that homework. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I appreciate Alex Partners, you giving us the help with that. And with that, I will say, folks, thank you all for being there, for doing the work that you're doing, keeping the supply chain moving. Please be safe and keep it going.